No niin, tervetuloa tähän Nuorten Akatemiaklubin vuosikertaan 2015-2016. Ja tämähän onkin meidän ensimmäinen kokous. Ja tavalliseen tapaan täällä on tietysti 2 esitelmää, joista ensimmäinen on tuossa taululla ja toinen tulee pitämään Marius Lahti aiheesta Development Origins of Mental Health, Helsingin Birth Cohort Study. No, nyt kun tämä on ensimmäinen kerta, niin pidetään pieni, että opittaisiin tuntemaan toisemme, pieni kevyt nimenhuuto. Se tarkoittaa, jokainen sanoo nimensä, alansa ja ehkä paikan, missä on töissä. No, voin aloittaa itsestäni. Olli Martio, olen tämän Suomalaisen tiedeakatemian pääsihteeri, tietysti eläkkeellä oleva professori, olen matemaatikko. Ja sitten
Järvinen, avaruusfysiikka on tieteenala, planeettatutkimus tarkemmin ja ilmatieteen laitos on paikka.
Marius Lahti, mä olen psykologia-alan tutkija ja olen Helsingin yliopiston tuolla käyttäytymistieteiden laitoksella töissä.
Ja Tuuli Haikonen, puutarhatieteet tai yleensä kasvibiologia, ja olen Luonnonvarakeskuksessa ja Piikkiön toimipisteessä Turun lähellä töissä.
Paavo Ojanen, metsäekologia ja osittain Helsingin yliopistolla, osittain Luonnonvarakeskuksessa, käytännössä tuolla Viikissä metsätieteiden laitoksella.
Sami Sjöberg, mä oon yleisen kirjallisuustieteen edustajana täällä ja mun toimipaikka on Helsingin yliopistossa.
Hei, Svetlana Vitchinikova, Helsingin yliopiston tohtoritutkija, nykykielten laitos, eli kielitieteilijä.
Tuomas Tallinen, fyysikko ja Jyväskylän yliopistolta.
Elina Salmela, yhdistieteen geenejä.
Antti Nissinen, biokemisti, tarkemmin immunologi ja Oulun yliopistosta.
Tuomas Kosonen, taloustieteilijä ja tällä hetkellä töissä valtion taloudellisessa tutkimuskeskuksessa eli VATTissa.
Adnan Osman, I work at the Aalto University and I work on space and astrophysical plasmas.
Juhana Salojärvi, oikeustieteestä pääaineen oikeushistoriatutkimusta teen Helsingin yliopistolla, mutta työskentelen niin kuin käytännön duuneissa myös tuolla yliopiston ulkopuolella.
no niin, aloitetaan sitten ensimmäisellä esitelmällä ja sitten jatketaan toisella ja sitten keskustellaan sen jälkeen, niin voi kysellä yhtä aikaa kummaltakin. Ole hyvä.
Kiitoksia. Thank you. Thank you for the Academy for this opportunity to be part of this club for this year, and it's also an honor to be the first one to start this session. So I will be talking about planetary science, space physics in general. My title is Solar Wind-Driven Atmospheric Erosion of Terrestrial Planets, and hopefully I will be able to open all the words in this title for you during this 30 minutes. So we will start from the terrestrial planets, atmospheric erosion, and then we move towards the solar wind interaction processes happening at these planets. My background is that I defended 2011, and since then I was an Academy of Finland postdoctoral researcher, and now I'm continuing as a research scientist at the Finnish Meteorological Institute. So this is our plan, how we will proceed with the talk. So first, a couple of words about the solar system and the origin and the history and development of the solar system. Then a few words about what are terrestrial planets. And Then we move forward to my research topic, which is the atmospheric erosion and planetary solar wind interactions. And at the end, hopefully, we will have time to summarize a little bit what we learned today, and then proceed with another presentation and then for the discussion. So the solar system originated something like 4.6 billion years ago. There was an interstellar cloud of gas which started to collapse, possibly due to some close-by supernova explosion or some other gravitational perturbation. This cloud of gas started to collapse, condense, and then it started to rotate because of its initial angular momentum. And from this we get the planets after 4.6 billion years. Formation of the planets themselves took maybe something like less than 100 million years. And then everything else happened since then for 4.5 billion years. In the beginning, everything more or less was mixed in this cloud of gas homogeneously. And then interesting things started to happen when we actually got the planets and the objects which make the current solar system we know. Let's look a little bit more in detail. Here we have a figure of the inner solar system, which we define to be anything inside the 1.5 AU. AU is a distance unit between the Sun and the Earth. So everything behind 1.5 or 1.6 is called the inner solar system here. So we have in the middle there the Sun. We have the closest planet to the Sun is called Mercury. Then we have Venus, Earth, and Mars. And just to give some scale, there on the left-hand side you see Jupiter, which is already almost at 6 AU. So that's called the outer solar system. Here is now some comparison of the 3 planets, the 2 planets and the Earth, 3 planets in total, which are considered to be terrestrial planets. Also Mercury is a terrestrial planet, but we will see it's a little bit different from these 3 planets. So Venus, Earth, and Mars. Venus is our closest planetary neighbor, and it's 28% closer to the Sun than the Earth. And due to this distance difference, it receives 1.9 times the sunlight than the Earth does. Whereas Mars is at 1.5 AU and it receives only less than half of the sunlight than the Earth does. This is due to distance scaling. And of course, due to gravitational interaction, the orbital periods of these planets around the Sun are different, as you can see. Now let's look more into detail about the terrestrial planets. So a terrestrial planet means that it's a planet made of rock mostly, as opposed to gas planets which are very far in the outer orbits around the Sun. So we have Mercury closest to the Sun, Venus, Earth, and Mars farthest from the Sun. Mercury is a body which looks most likely like something like a moon. It doesn't have an atmosphere. It's this kind of bulky gray body, and it's very close to the Sun compared to these other ones. Venus is then the planet closest to the Earth, which was also already mentioned. It's the most Earth-like planet in terms of size and location in the solar system. So it's considered to be our sister planet. But it's very hot. It has a huge carbon dioxide atmosphere, and it doesn't have a lot of water in it at all anymore. And it's completely unmagnetized. We will come back to magnetic fields and what they have to do with all of this later in this presentation. Earth, as we know, is a water-rich planet. We have life supporting environment, and Earth also possesses a strong global magnetic field, which is made in the core, in the outer core of our planet beneath the surface. Mars is the smallest of these planets with Mercury. It has a thin carbon dioxide atmosphere. It's very cold on the surface, and it's also quite dry. But as we have recently heard, there is some water also flowing on Mars, but the amounts of water are not as large as on Earth. Mars is also nowadays globally unmagnetized planet, but it possesses certain regions on its surface or in its crust that have magnetic anomaly regions. And this means that Mars once had a strong global magnetic field, but nowadays it has vanished. So now if we look at these planets and think about their region in the solar system and that they formed in similar conditions, they are pretty different these days. And now planetary science studies why the planets are so different. What were the processes that drove them to become like this? We see them today. Let's go more into detail about the differences. Water is an important substance not only for life but all kinds of planetary processes. Like at Earth, it contributes to the carbon cycle very much. It contributes to the plate tectonics most likely. Sort of it drives the evolution of a planet in many ways. And there is now on the right-hand side a figure where we compare the water inventory at Venus, Earth and Mars as we observe today. So the vertical axis is a fraction of water found on these planets divided by the mass of the whole planet. So it's a mass fraction of water found on these planets. And the darker blue bar is the amount of all water on the planet, and the lighter blue bar is the amount of water present in the atmosphere. So now as we right away notice from here, by the way, it's a logarithmic scale, so the differences are huge here. So as we right away notice from here, Venus has very little water. If we would put all the water that is present at Venus on its surface, that would make 2 centimeter layer. Whereas at Earth, if we take all the water which is in the oceans and atmosphere and all hydrosphere, that height would be 2.7 kilometers. For Mars, the amount of water is also less than Earth, but it's more uncertain if it's 20 meters or 30 meters or maybe even up to 500 meters, but that's the most we believe there is. If we look more into details, we can look something called the isotope ratios. So all the elements come in different isotopes. And this means that the element is chemically the same, but there is a different amount of neutrons in its nucleus, in the atom nucleus. And if we compare deuterium, which is the heavy hydrogen, to normal hydrogen, this kind of ratio on Venus and Earth, we see that Venus has a highly enriched deuterium to hydrogen ratio, 120 times the Earth. And now if you want to change a ratio D to H, you have two options. If you want to enrich it, you either increase D or decrease H. And we don't know how we could increase D. Basically, deuterium is there and we don't know how to produce more. But H we can change by escape. And we believe that Venus has actually lost a lot of H. And this has now got to do with the atmospheric erosion processes, which we will talk after a couple of slides. Also, when we look Mars, we have many rovers there, we have many measurements from Mars. Mars is one of the studied planets after the Earth. So when we see the geology and minerals on Mars, we have evidence of a wet planet in the past. Most likely there has been a lot more water than today. So the question rises, what happened to water on Venus and Mars, the original water present in these planets? There are also other types of volatiles, such as carbon dioxide, which are very interesting, but I will not show those inventories here because I believe the water is enough to raise your interest in this topic. Now, let's talk about the atmospheres of the planets a little bit. This is a photograph from the International Space Station looking through the Earth's atmosphere. So on the lower part you see the surface and the lower atmosphere. Then when we rise higher we go to the middle atmosphere, and then when we go really high we get to the upper atmosphere where the ionospheric particles and gases become ionized, so they become electrically charged due to radiation, due to particle processes. And this is the region where atmospheric erosion processes happen. So atmospheric erosion is an escape of a planetary atmosphere to space due to different reasons. We will discuss about few reasons why the atmospheres get escaped to space. But the ionosphere and the exosphere are the layers of the atmosphere where our research takes place. So ionosphere is the main region of the charged particles in the atmosphere, and then exosphere is the higher region where the particle collisions stop because it's so tenuous already. And then we move to solar wind and magnetosphere regions, which we will see next in more detail. Yeah, so as mentioned, planetary atmospheres leak to space, and how this happens is that when you have a gravitational field of a planet, that basically bounds the atmosphere very well to the terrestrial planets. It's just a gravitational interaction. You can remove maybe hydrogen from Mars, which is the smallest of these bodies, little bit of hydrogen, but everything else is gravitationally very well bound due to the huge planetary mass. But we do have external energy sources, such as the sunlight. The sunlight drives all life on Earth. It drives many things here, the climate and so on. Then we have the solar wind, which is also an external forcing. It's a continuous stream of charged particles which is emitted from the sun. That's just a property of the sun. Once it came to being, it started to blow this kind of solar wind. It's an ever-going process. It creates northern lights and geomagnetic storms and so on. And it also drives the erosion of these ionized particles in the upper atmosphere. Then also impacts and collisions in the solar system are a source of external energy which can lead to escape of planetary atmospheres and planetary material to space. But nowadays this is not an important source of energy deposit because these are so infrequent, these collisions and impacts. But in the young solar system there was definitely a lot of impacts which contributed to these atmospheric erosion processes. But the reason we are interested in the solar wind is that the sunlight alone is not enough to remove any material from the terrestrial planets these days. So the gravity is enough to keep pretty much everything there from the sunlight. When the sun was more active, when it was younger for a certain time, then it was so that it heated up the atmospheres of terrestrial planets so that some of the stuff could escape. But since the sun entered its so-called main sequence life, its luminosity has been very stable for the past 4 billion years. And so it is still today for the next 4 billion years. But the solar wind is something that can do a difference here. So as mentioned, the solar wind is this blow of electric particles, mostly protons and electrons from the sun, and it encounters planets when it moves in the solar system, in the heliosphere. Now, a magnetosphere is an area which is defined by the interaction between a planetary environment and the solar wind. So where you can see the interaction between the planet's magnetic field or the upper atmosphere and the solar wind, you call it a magnetosphere. At Earth, this magnetosphere is huge because of our strong intrinsic magnetic field. This is huge compared to Venus and Mars. Venus and Mars don't have global magnetic fields, they just have this charged layer in their upper atmosphere, and so their interaction region, the magnetosphere, is much smaller than at Earth. And this is the field we are studying in. We compare the atmospheric interactions of Mars, Venus and Earth, and also other bodies, but today we will focus on these three. This is measurements. This was a lot of background already, so let's see some actual data. This is from Venus. This is measured by partly Finnish-built instrument Aspera 4 on Venus Express mission. There is a planet is in the middle. Its surface is denoted by the circle with the day side in gray and night side in black. And the sun is here. The solar wind is blowing from here. And now what we have here shown is a projection of solar wind flowing around these planets, around this planet, Venus in this case. So you can see these are vectors, arrows, so the solar wind comes in very close to Venus and then it passes by it because of the interaction with the planetary atmosphere, the magnetosphere and the solar wind. This is solar wind protons. And there is a creation of what is called a magnetotail, which is also much smaller than at Earth. So the scales are really much smaller than at Earth. The solar wind can come really close to this planet. And because of this, we see on the right-hand side the escape, the atmospheric erosion of oxygen particles. Actually, it's all the heavier particles than mass number 12, but it's mostly oxygen because oxygen is the dominant species in the upper atmospheres. But we can really measure it. It's the same instrument. It can measure the solar wind, but it can also measure the planetary species. And we see how they are leaking from the upper atmosphere and leaving the planet towards the tail and then will be blown off forever from the planet. This is measured. We have similar instrument on Mars, also partly of Finnish origin, Aspera 3 on Mars Express mission. We have similar plot for Mars. There is again the solar wind blowing here, coming to the planet, and then passing it by very close. And there again you see the leakage of oxygen and heavier ions away from the planetary atmosphere. Now we can also measure the hydrogen which is escaping from the planet, but that's much harder to differentiate because the solar wind is also made of hydrogen, protons basically. So that's why we are usually showing these heavy ions such as oxygen. They are so easy to separate from the solar wind. So we know it's leaking. At Earth, this process is different, how the atmosphere gets escape, and it has got to do with the magnetic field. So the solar wind, so this is now the Earth solar wind is blowing again from here, and there you see the Earth's magnetic field and how it's interacting with the solar wind. But what happens at Earth is that the solar wind is stopped actually quite far from the planet itself, and it passes by quite far from the atmosphere. So it cannot directly go and remove these atmospheric particles, what happens at Venus and Mars. But it can cause geomagnetic storms, and it can cause magnetospheric dynamics, and it can cause, for example, auroras in the polar regions. And the same processes that lead to these auroral storms and magnetic storms in the Earth's magnetosphere, they also heat up the particles, upper atmospheric particles in the Earth's polar regions. And these particles can leak away from our atmosphere to space. And this is what is shown here in a simulation figure. And this is called the ionospheric polar wind, which is leaking from the polar regions. Now, because of many reasons, this magnetosphere or an intrinsic magnetic field has been thought to protect our planet from all kinds of evil, such as cosmic rays, which it does. It protects us from cosmic rays, but it's also been thought that it protects us from this atmospheric escape to space. And this is called the magnetic umbrella hypothesis. But now just recently in our field we have observed all these three planets and compared them side by side. And when we do this comparison, we actually see that the same amount of elements is actually escaping from all the planets, from Venus, Earth and Mars. And this actually questions this magnetic umbrella hypothesis very much. And the reason actually for this escape or for this whole change in thinking is that this may not be an umbrella, but it's also a focusing lens. It protects us from the solar wind itself, from the particles in the solar wind. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't protect us from the electromagnetic energy. So in this magnetosphere, electromagnetic energy, so electric and magnetic fields, are focused very close to the Earth. And that's what is then energizing partly of this escape. So this is right now happening in our field, that we are really just starting to understand that the magnetic field may not be protecting us from actually losing elements to space. What we do in Kumpula and what I've been doing for the past 10 years during my studies and postdoctoral project is modeling this atmospheric erosion. You saw already a modeling figure from the Earth, but our main targets have been unmagnetized planets such as Mars and Venus, and also we do comets and smaller bodies like the moons in the solar system. So here is again the sun on the left, and it's blowing towards the planets. Mars is here, Venus is there, denoted by this ball, and what we see here is the trajectories of escaping oxygen ions from the upper atmosphere of this planet. And there you can see also oxygen in the orange one, and then also lighter species such as the hydrogen with the blue ones. And in a model you can really study many things because everything is under your control. You run it in a supercomputer, you can set your conditions on the sun, you can set your conditions on the planet, and then see how the physics behaves. And if you are more interested, there is a website there in the upper corner. We have everything open source online. Now, the questions what we are currently facing with, the bigger ones. I picked up the bigger questions here because I think it's more interesting for the discussion. So how much we have lost different volatiles at different terrestrial planets during the evolution of the solar system? We don't know. We assume that we started with similar inventories 4.6 billion years ago, but then something changed because Earth has water, Venus and Mars don't. What is the role of the planetary magnetic field and the solar wind on this change, on this erosion? And also now an interesting thing is just happening because astronomical observations are becoming really good. We have big telescopes which we can use to look to the sky, and there is a diagram of different types of stars we have observed in astronomical observations, and we can observe many types of stars which are similar to Sun but with different stages of their development. We can see what the Sun was most likely in its early childhood and how it's evolving in the future. And it's also becoming possible to observe other planetary systems around these stars. So most likely we can after some time look and see what is happening in a young solar system similar to ours. Actually, we already have seen that. We can see some huge gas planets which are very close to their stars. We can see them in remote observations, in telescope observations, and we have even observed some features which we believe are due to atmospheric erosion processes. But this field is heavily now increasing and becoming very interesting to us. Okay, I will summarize now. Terrestrial planets formed in the young solar system in similar conditions. But since then we have got big changes in inventories of different material. Here we considered water because it's very important for many things. We don't know if the magnetic field protected us from losing all our water to space, and did it allow even life to form because of the water. And we are studying this by modeling combined with in situ observations in the solar system, and then also in the future by the astronomical observations from the younger stars, older stars and planetary systems. So with this I thank you for your attention, and let's move to the second talk.
Thank you. Now time for the next talk. Please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so hello everyone. My name is Marius Lahti. I'm from the Developmental Psychology Research Group at the Institute of Behavioral Sciences at the University of Helsinki. I'd like to thank the Academy for the possibility to participate in this Young Researchers Club and for the possibility to present our research here. Today I'm going to talk to you, describe to you studies in the Helsinki Berg cohort study of the developmental origins of mental disorders. All these studies have been done in close collaboration with the National Institute for Health and Welfare. Why to study mental disorders? Mental disorders place a high burden on the affected individual and on the society. The estimated one-year prevalence of mental disorders in Europe is 38.4%. They are associated with 15 to 20 years shorter life expectancy and are the leading cause of years lived with disability worldwide. This years lived with disability means practically years when people are not working and are on sick leave or in hospitals. And due to these reasons, consensus exists in epidemiological research that early prevention of mental disorders is a key public health target, and longitudinal studies identifying their risk factors are needed. Our research framework that has gained increasing attention in the studies of developmental origins of chronic diseases, both somatic and mental illnesses, is the developmental origins of health and disease framework. According to this framework, a suboptimal early life environment may permanently alter the structure and function of cells, tissues, and body's biological feedback mechanisms, feedback systems, thereby setting forth an increased risk for chronic diseases later in life. Supporting this research framework are findings from several different studies that show that low birth weight and preterm birth, meaning that a child is born at before 37 weeks of gestation, that are used as proxies of prenatal fetal adversities, consistently predict increased risks of coronary heart disease, its risk factors such as hypertension, and all-cause premature mortality. And also an increasing amount of studies show that the increased risks for set forth by adverse early life circumstances, both prenatal occurring in the womb and early postnatal in the childhood period, concerns not only the risk of chronic somatic illnesses, but also the risks of mental disorders. Hence, in the current study, we will address certain early life risk factors for mental disorders using a longitudinal study design. I will now briefly explain these kind of key concepts in our study, and if there's any questions about the meaning, I'm happy to answer about them also immediately. So if you have questions, please address. So we examine these more general risk factors related to the prenatal environment the child is exposed to, fetal growth in terms of how how big the body size is at birth in relation to the duration of pregnancy, that is referred to as gestation length. We'll also examine individual differences in gestation length, whether the child is born preterm before 37 weeks of gestation or postterm after 42 weeks of gestation, and how these factors relate to risk of mental disorders in adulthood in comparison to being born at term age between 37 and 42 weeks of gestation. We also address more specific factors related to the prenatal environment, this being maternal hypertensive disorders during pregnancy, defined as any hypertension occurring when the mother is pregnant, how that affects child's well-being, and also preeclampsia, that is also in addition to maternal hypertension defined as by the mother having protein in her urea. And we assess the effects of maternal parity, that is that from how many pregnancy the child is born. We also assess certain childhood risk factors for mental health that may or may not play a role in the etiology of mental disorders, and this being separation from both biological parents in early childhood and childhood socioeconomic adversity in terms of both parents having low occupational status and the circumstances of the family being hence poorer. And I will then give a bit more detailed definitions on how we address these risk factors. We studied all these early life risk factors for mental disorders among the participants of the Helsinki birth cohort study 1934-1944. This cohort comprises all live singleton births at the two public maternity hospitals of Helsinki, Finland, between the years 1934 and 44. The participants were born either at Naisten Klinikka or Yliopisto, that were the public maternity hospitals at the time. And the cohort comprises 6,975 men and 6,370 women. We have observed the register-based data on all of our early life exposures. We have data on from birth records on body size at birth, that is defined based on weight, length, and head circumference at birth, and length, how long the pregnancy lasted from the same birth records, and also on parity and on these hypertensive pregnancy disorders. And both from these birth records and from child welfare and school records that were kept in Finland during those days and are still all of these records are in place, we get data on parental occupational statuses, and we defined childhood socioeconomic position on maternal and paternal occupation statuses, whether or not both of the parents were manual workers or either of them were lower or upper clerical workers. During 1930s and 1940s, it was rather common in the Finnish society that both of the parents were working throughout the childhood. So in this circumstance also the maternal occupation status is a good indicator of the socioeconomic position, and especially the combination of these two, while this was in some later decades after World War II, then a bit different kind of situation here. And how did we define childhood separation from biological parents? Our cohort members spent their childhood during the years of World War II, and during World War II over 80,000 Finnish children were evacuated to interim foster care without either of their parents. They were evacuated abroad either to Sweden or to Denmark or to some other countries to escape the hazards of war. While the circumstances in foster care varied a lot for the different children, all these children were exposed to separation from both of their parents. That, based on previous studies, has been associated with risk of mental disorders later in life. What we had in our current study that was not available in most previous studies, we had this objective register data on the separation exposures. Most previous studies have used retrospective questionnaire data where they ask in adulthood whether or not that child had been separated from their parents. And such retrospective recollections are subjective to bias in memory that may also be affected by the current mental health of the participant. So, and as all of these children also returned to Finland after World War II, they did not stay in their foster families, but they returned to their biological parents, in some cases only due to political reasons, because there was a huge pressure on the Finnish government that if these children stay in other countries, they should be considered war losses. So without asking from either the foster parents or the biological parents, the children were told to come back to Finland. And through this route, these children were actually exposed to parental separation twice, both from their biological parents and later from their foster care parents. And we have identified these children who were evacuated from the Finnish National Archives. These archives have data on all children who were evacuated and the age and the duration of the evacuations. Here's an example of the Child Transfer Committee's transfer card having different kinds of data. Here would have been the name of the child, then the age when they were evacuated, the length of evacuation and the health of the participant, and also some information of the foster family. Through this information we can also study whether the age at evacuation and separation from parents played a predictive role for mental disorders, whether early or later separations had more evident effects. Here's some statistics of the prevalences of the different early life exposures we studied as possible risk factors for mental disorders. You can see that some of them were more common than others, low socioeconomic position being the most common risk factor, but among the over 13,000 cohort participants, all of these exposures we studied were in place for over 200 participants, some of them for 1 to 2,000, and giving us enough statistical power to detect the effects of at least the expected size that was based on previous studies in the field. We identified mental disorders as severe mental disorders leading to hospitalization or cause of death. In Finland, all hospital discharge diagnoses and all causes of death are registered in the Finnish hospital discharge and causes of death registers. In 1969, all Finnish citizens were given a personal identity code through which this follow-up is possible. We don't need to use the participants' names. Rather, we can, without any real way to identify the individual persons, we use follow-up data from these registers, and we have been able, through this personal identity numbers and codes, link these mental disorder data with the early life exposures just mentioned. And we have followed up the mental disorders from the early adulthood of the participants from the year 1969 onwards until 2010. And throughout this time period, 1,672 participants were hospitalized with any mental disorder or had a mental disorder as a cause of death. Mental disorders were a little bit more common among men than among women, which is also a typical finding. we used following diagnostic outcomes as our dependent variables. We studied the effects of the early life adversities on the risk of substance use, mood, anxiety, psychotic and personality disorders, and suicides and suicide attempts, and also used a more general outcome, any mental disorder, combining these different diagnostic outcomes. Here are some prevalences of the different mental disorders. Substance use disorders and mood disorders were the most common mental disorders in our study sample. I'm sorry about a bit small font size in this slide, but the prevalence of substance use disorders was 7%, that of mood disorders approximately 5%, and other diagnostic outcomes were a bit less common, but for example, 1% of our study sample committed suicide in adult life. And the general diagnostic outcome, any mental disorder, its prevalence was 13% in our study sample. This is smaller than what was previously mentioned for mental disorders in Europe, but we must keep in mind that our mental disorders are only 7 mental disorders that led to hospitalization or were registered as cause of death. Hence, we do not study here less severe cases where the mental disorders were treated in outpatient care or the affected individual did not get any treatment for his mental health problems. So I will next move to our main study findings, going through them, each predictive factor in turn and their effects on these 7 mental disorders. First, we addressed whether or not these hypertensive disorders, hypertension during pregnancy without proteinuria or with proteinuria, that being called preeclampsia, which is in Finnish raskausmyrkytys, whether these factors predicted the risk of mental disorders in the offspring in adulthood. Indeed, these figures illustrate the hazard ratios of different mental disorders and diagnostic outcomes in a study sample. What we found was that so in these figures we compare those with gestational hypertension without proteinuria to those who were not born after normotensive pregnancies. And we found that children whose mothers had hypertension during pregnancy without proteinuria had significantly increased, approximately 1.2-fold risk of any 7 mental disorder across adulthood, and 1.5-fold significantly increased risk of mood disorders and quite similar risk of anxiety disorders in adult life. Preeclampsia in turn was not associated with offspring risk of mental disorders in our study sample. And next we looked at maternal grand multiparity. This parity was the risk factor that from how many pregnancy the child is born. Previous studies have suggested that children born from 6th or later pregnancies may have increased risk of psychopathology later in life, and this being born from 6th or later pregnancy is defined as maternal grand multiparity. Hence we examined the effects of this prenatal risk factor on the severe mental disorders in the offspring in our study sample that had a longer follow-up period than the previous studies in the field. Our findings corresponded to previous findings in that we found that maternal grand multiparity was associated with significantly increased risk of suicide attempts and severe mood disorders in the offspring. These figures illustrate the cumulative incidence of these diagnostic outcomes here for mood disorders across adult ages. On the x-axis is the age of the participant, on the y-axis is the cumulative incidence of mental disorders, the amount of participants who had been diagnosed with mental disorders by that age. And we found that maternal grand multiparity was there once children born to grand multiparous mothers are in the gray color, and in the black color below is those born from earlier pregnancies. And we found that maternal grand multiparity was associated with 1.6-fold significantly increased risk of mood disorders in adult life, and a nowhere 3.5-fold risk of suicide attempts in adulthood. And these effects come evident after 35 years of age in adulthood, when most of are evident after that throughout the adult ages. For most of our study sample, the follow-up period started between 25 and 35 years of age, and that's why we don't find any effects before that. There was also some sex specificity of the findings. Maternal grand multiparity showed significant interactions with child sex in predicting the risks of any severe mental disorders and substance use disorders in adult life. While we found no significant associations of maternal grand multiparity and mental disorders among men, we found much stronger associations among women. Women born from 6 or later pregnancies had over 2-fold significantly increased risk of any severe mental disorder, substance use, mood and psychotic disorders, and over 4-fold risk of suicide attempts in adulthood in comparison to children born from earlier pregnancies. And then, sorry, if I'm moving a bit quickly, next we address the effects of fetal growth, body size at birth, how big the baby is, and in comparison to how long the pregnancy lasted. This is kind of an index of the circumstances of the baby during the fetal life. It can be addressed in different ways. Firstly, we looked at the effects of head circumference at birth on the risk of personality disorders in adulthood. These personality disorders are severe mental disorders that are evident as in multiple aspects of life and in culturally untypical ways of relating to self and others, and performing in occupational life, in interpersonal life, and other circumstances that lead to severe impairments of functioning and or subjective impairment in these various aspects of life. And we found that if a child had at birth a small head circumference, smaller than average, this offspring then had significantly increased, approximately 1.5-fold risk of personality disorders in adulthood, comparison to those who were born with average size head circumference at birth. This head circumference can be seen as a rather crude proxy of fetal brain growth, but in that sense that it is associated with brain growth during the prenatal period, it is not surprising that it is also associated with later mental disorders, since the brain grows quickest during the prenatal period, and also individual differences in brain anatomy and functioning are found in different types of mental disorders. And then next we looked at this more general marker of fetal growth, birth weight, and in its association to gestational age, in a way that a typical way to define suboptimal fetal growth is to look at children who were born small for gestational age at below -2 standard deviation of that typical for the population of that would be predicted by their pregnancy duration. And we found that those participants of a cohort who had been born small for gestational age had significantly increased 1.4-fold risk of any mental disorder and 1.7-fold risk of substance use disorders in adult life compared to individuals who were born at appropriate for gestational age size. You can see that the risks for different mental health outcomes among these participants were rather similarly increased, but since substance use disorders and this category of any mental disorder were the most common ones in our cohort, the statistically significant findings were related to them. And then going onwards, we looked at individual differences in gestation length, how long the pregnancy had lasted. Postpartum birth is defined as pregnancy that is longer than is typical, over 42 weeks of gestation. And we found that in our cohort, those individuals who had been born postpartum had, in comparison to term-born participants whose gestation length was between 37 and 42 weeks, they had these postpartum individuals had in adulthood significantly increased risk of any severe mental disorder and substance use and anxiety disorders. These associations were stronger and statistically significant among men. That is illustrated also in this figure. Among men, postpartum birth was also associated with an increased risk of suicide attempts. Preterm birth, being born at before 37 weeks of gestation, was bit surprisingly not associated with the risk of mental disorders in our study sample, but in the total sample, and it was neither associated with the risk of mental disorders among women, but we found a sex-specific effect on suicide risk among men. So men who had been born preterm at before 37 weeks of gestation had a significantly increased, approximately 2-fold risk of suicides in adulthood in comparison to term-born individuals. And then to move onwards to our childhood risk factors, we addressed the effects of low socioeconomic position in childhood on the risk of mental disorders in adulthood, and found that those children whose both parents had been manual workers, they had an increased risk of any severe mental disorder and substance use disorders across adulthood. These risks were approximately 1.2 and 1.3-fold, and again more evident among men than among women. And also parental separation in childhood due to the World War two evacuations predicted the risk of mental disorders in adult life. In comparison to the children who were left in Finland during that same time period and who were of similar age and from similar childhood socioeconomic circumstances, those children who had been separated from their parents in childhood had significantly increased risk of any severe mental disorder, substance use disorders, and particularly personality disorders in adulthood. The risk for any severe mental disorder was approximately 1.2-fold, for substance use disorders 1.3-fold, and for personality disorders 1.6-fold. We also found that these effects of parental separation were actually strong among those children whose socioeconomic background in the family of origin had been higher. Hence, if the parents had been clerical workers in comparison to children from similar backgrounds, those children who were then separated from their parents had over 2-fold risk of any severe mental disorder, and also significantly increased similar risk for substance use, mood, psychotic and personality disorders. While among children from lower socioeconomic position, the separation exposure did not add so much to the already increased risk for mental disorders that was in place due to their poorer socioeconomic circumstances. And we also found some sensitivity periods for these effects of parental separation. Particularly for personality disorders, that was the mental health outcome most affected by these parental separations. Separation exposure during early childhood, before 5 years of age, was associated with significantly increased risk of any personality disorder, and particularly dramatic personality disorders that are most evident in the areas of affect regulation, impulsivity, suicidality, aggression towards self and others, and difficulties in interpersonal relationships. So here's a not so brief summary of our findings that I will not go again through individually, but I will sum this slide by saying that different types of prenatal risk factors predict the increased risk of psychopathology across adulthood, and the same can be said for our childhood risk factors, separation from parents, and for socioeconomic adversity in early life. With this longitudinal registered data, some of our early life risk factors, such as preterm birth and body size at birth, are more crude proxies of the prenatal environmental circumstances, and we cannot be sure based on our study why these, let's say, individuals born small for gestational age or postpartum had increased risk of mental disorders in adulthood, but other studies have found that factors such as maternal psychosocial stress, substance use, metabolic disturbances, and infectious illnesses and malnutrition during pregnancy are associated with body size at birth and with individual differences in gestation length, and these factors have also been associated with offspring risk of mental health problems in very recent studies, and we can hence at least speculate that these factors may underlie our associations. For the parental separation exposure in early childhood, a possible mechanism may be that it has been shown that children who have been separated from their parents have difficulties in their interpersonal development, and this leading to insecure attachment with their parents, and these factors also contribute to later risk of mental health problems. So this might be one pathway through which these effects take place. On a neurobiological level, early life adversity, both pre and postnatal, have been shown to lead to alterations in the brain's stress system, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. It's functioning, these changes indicating altered vulnerability to stress, and such changes are also found in patients with mental disorders. This may be one neurobiological pathway for which lots of support has been gained, that this may be a mediating factor in these associations. And on a cellular level, these changes may be mediated by epigenetic changes in gene expression that are known to occur as a consequence of early life adversity and also associate with the risk of mental disorders. Unfortunately, we did not have data on parental mental disorders in our study sample, so we cannot exclude that some shared familial risk factors, genetic vulnerabilities that may also lead to these early life adversities and contribute to the risk of mental disorders may have played a we can neither confirm or refute their role in explaining the associations found, but based on other recent studies using both sibling study and twin study design, We know that the studied pre- and postnatal risk factors for mental disorders, both the preterm birth, body size at birth, parental separation, they have their own effects independent of familiar confounding on mental health risk later in life, albeit some of the associations may be mediated by these factors, but it would certainly seem that not all of them are explained by these factors, but early life adversity has its own effects on psychopathology risk. As all studies, our study has its strengths and limitations. The limitations include that our cohort was born several decades ago. One can question how well our findings generalize to modern day surroundings in more recent cohorts, but in order to assess effects on mental disorders across adult life, we need to have participants who have already reached adult age and for whom these diagnostic outcomes can be studied. But actually we see rather similar findings in younger cohorts as well. And since, as stated, since the registered data we had on mental disorders cover only 7 mental disorders, our findings are also best generalized to 7 mental disorders in need of hospitalization or contributing to death. On the other hand, our study had a large sample size, was representative of the cohort born during those years. We used a longitudinal study design, had objective register-based data on the early life exposures and validated register data on the mental disorders. So to conclude, our findings from the longitudinal Helsinki birth cohort study support the developmental origins of health and disease framework by highlighting the predictive role played by different types of early life adversity, both prenatal and early childhood factors and the risk of severe mental disorders across adulthood. And while we cannot be based on certain about the underlying cellular mechanisms yet, even though such studies are also being conducted, we can conclude based on our findings that and other findings from other study cohorts so far that the vulnerability to severe mental disorders is evident in early life. So I like to thank my collaborators on these studies, especially Professors Katri Räikkä and Johan Eriksson and Anu-Katriina Pesonen have been played essential role in these studies, and Professor David Barker was he was kind of the developer of this research framework, and we have been collaborating with him and Clive Osman from Southampton for several years. And I like to thank you, the audience.
Thank you for the lecture. Well, the lectures here, I mean, they have been usually presented in Finnish, usually with, well, I mean, varies if there is an English text or Finnish text, and there are also have been lectures in English with Finnish texts. So everything is possible. Don't be afraid to use your own method. Okay, so now please come here. I mean to. So let's put up the discussion now. I think that almost any language can be used here, even if, well, I can say about myself, I speak every possible language, but English I speak bestest. So, kuka haluaa aloittaa?
My I'd like to ask Marius for the start about the implications of the findings that you get from such research studies. So what I'm interested in is how are these findings usually used? So you, for instance, you find that children who are born in to families with lower socioeconomical background are more exposed or kind of are more at risk in getting a mental disorder late in life. So how would that be used in, I don't know, maybe monitoring of the families, or what's done?
Thank you for the question. An approach that is used is to kind of make these more general interventions to these families. This is kind of the aim to be used also more often than it is currently done. But for example, in the United States, there has been wide programs, this early start program where they focus on children with families with socioeconomic adversity and try to support the child's development by giving guidance to the parents on parenting behaviors and how to relate to their child and support them with their problems. So that's kind of one general idea, that if we identify these risk factors, we could then have these more targeted preventive interventions where we know, let's say, factors like preterm birth, body size at birth. We get this data already at child welfare birth record clinics. We can give also this, before anyone develops a mental disorder, we can give this rather also general guidance at that level, like primary prevention in terms of trying to help the children, the parents of the children and the families, also then the children to with their development, not by putting any blame on anyone, but rather to try to, I think the approach would be to kind of try to help the families in their everyday life. And sometimes the risk factor is already there, but there are other things also in the childhood environment, like parenting practices that are associated with later risk of mental health. And by supporting the families with such factors, you can then possibly help them with alleviating the increased risks also. So I think that's one.
Thank you, very comprehensive answer. And I suppose it depends on the kind of adversity that's identified. So if you find that, for instance, if you separate the child from their parents early in life, you better not do that, right? So, thank you.
I would like to ask a question about methodology from both of the presenters. For the Marius' study, you just reply about what kind of policy implications your findings have, but you say that you find associations, and isn't it so that to be able to really convincingly speak to the policy, you would need to find causal answers. So just that if you find associations in data, isn't it possible that it just happens that these same factors, mental disorders and some background factors that you are looking at, just happen to occur in one person, and then we still would need to know how they would respond to some changes in environment, for example. Although I have to say that maybe you can find something from the displacements, because that's more exogenous, maybe. And for the other study, it seems that if I understood correctly, that the main methodology was to sort of build a theory model and compare with actual data, whether they sort of match So my question is that there's not many great number of planets that we observe. So is like just that how many what kind of data you have to map whether the you mentioned something about that. It sounded very interesting, but I just would like to know more about how many do we rely on 2 observations or 200 or what how does it look like?
Either way.
Please go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. It's a very important comment and question. One thing in the causal relations are certainly needed to be certified, and our studies are showing these longitudinal associations, while they have some more power to at least infer something about the direction of causality than some like cross-sectional study designs. Certainly there may be other factors playing a role. The common approach in our research field is that because we, due to ethical reasons, that no one would conduct kind of a study where they purposefully expose a child to a possible early life adversity, separate them from parents or stress the mother or do things like that. Then we are relying on these like natural experiments in a way that this childhood separation was. But what we can do is we can then look in animal models these effects more like using experimental designs and make causal implications based on those in a way, as long as there's the resemblance between the animal model studied and the human studies. But I think that's a very common approach in these studies, that we actually do see, like in animal studies, the effects of these early life exposures both on the brain development and on similar like behavioral phenotypes that might resemble the mental disorders in humans, and also on a cellular level on epigenetic changes in gene expression in models, in studies where we can more in a more controlled way look at the study questions by controlling for genetic factors, controlling for other environmental factors and such. So I think it's often the combination of these different approaches that is being used.
Okay, so the question was on our measurements and how many measurements we have. And we do have a lot of measurements from certain objects. So our neighboring planets, Mars and Venus, because we know that we had to look for these processes operating at those planets. So we do have good data sets from there. Venus was explored by a big American mission in the already starting from the 70s until the 90s. That was like 14 years of observations, and then we continued in Europe by this Venus Express mission for the past 9 years, which just concluded in this January. So we do have good data sets from there, and also Mars is now being explored by several spacecraft. So those planets we know more or less very well what happens at atmospheric erosion there. Many details to work out, but I believe we have the data sets we need to start working on those places. But maybe paradoxically, like for the Earth, we don't have such good data sets for how the atmospheres leak to space. And we do have data, but nothing too specific which would have been looking into just this question. And I hope this will change in the future, that we do have some missions which are just operating right now since last year, but then another other interesting point is this, as I mentioned, the other stars and the astronomical observations, because our telescopes are becoming big. And well, I'm not an astronomer, but as a physicist, I will be very interested to see those data once we start to really see single planets around other stars. And that will tell us a lot about different types of planets in different stages of their evolution.
Can I, so, thanks for that answer. What I meant a little bit was that you observe, you say you observe 2 planets that are close to Earth. Although you have many observations from those planets, they just are how they are, you know. So you said that there was this magnetic umbrella hypothesis before, and now it doesn't look like it's holding. So basically, because you cannot treat planets like experiments, or just experiment with planets, so you need to rely on observing them. And since we don't observe them 1 million years ago, we just observe them how they are now. So that's why it sounded interesting when you say you can also observe more distant planets with these new telescopes and maybe observe them at different stages of development. So basically, if I'm putting that to 2 planets into the causal paradigm, basically you just have 2 observations because they are the same 2 planets each time you observe them. So that was what I was asking more closely about how many different planets and in different stages you observe.
Yes, that's a good point, and that's where the modeling comes in. Because in a model we can build a model which works in the current situations, and which we have done. And then we can use that model to expand our knowledge a little bit by changing the parameters and extrapolating a little bit in the model, like how physics works when you go into earlier times or in the future too. So yeah, that's very much why we rely on modeling, because we only have few planets here in the inner solar system, and we have a long time of history which has integrated and to become the present situation. So yes, absolutely, we would love to have more data points in terms of objects.
Ehkä minäkin tässä väillä, kun tuli tämä atmosfeer, jatkan pikkusen suomeksi. Mainitsit, että tämä hapen eroosio ilmakehästä on niin kuin näillä planeetoilla niin kuin yhtä suurta, näyttää olevan. Mutta eikö tätä happea on näissä ilmakehissä hyvin eri tavalla, siis eri paljon suorastaan. Siis Merkuriuksessa, Venuksessa ja ei tarkoita Venuksessa, Maassa ja Marsissa. Onko se niin kuin määrällisesti, prosentuaalisesti vai kerta kaikkiaan kilogrammoja, se hapen eroosio? Onko se missä suhteessa se on yhtä suurta?
Joo, tässä on kaksi asiaa. Eli joo, nämä ilmakehät on erilaisia koostumukseltaan. Mars ja Venus on hiilidioksidia pääosin. Ja sitten Maassa on taas paljon typpeä ja happea ihan täällä alailmakehässä. Mutta sitten kun mennään yläilmakehään, tavallaan kaikki kemia, mikä tapahtuu, niin sillä on semmoinen vaikutus, että happi on itse asiassa se dominoiva kaasu tai hiukkaslaji kaikkien näiden planeettojen yläilmakehässä silloin, kun se on fotodissosioitunut, hajonnut nämä molekyylit ja näin. Eli siinä mielessä sitä on kyllä paljon saatavilla siellä ihan ylimmässä ilmakehässä. Se hapen eroosion määrä itse asiassa nykyään, mikä me tiedetään, niin se ei ole itse asiassa merkittävä enää ollenkaan tällä hetkellä. Eli tällä hetkellä sitä, niin kuin, jos se eroosio olisi tapahtunut tämmöisellä vauhdilla, mitä se nykyään tapahtuu, niin puhutaan noin kilogrammasta sekunti, joka ei ole paljon, kun ajatellaan paljon meillä on massaa ilmakehässä. Mutta sen on oltava jollain tavalla poistunut näiden veden osa-aineiden, hapen ja vedyn näistä ilmakehistä aikaisemmin. Ja se on tavallaan se, mihinkä me tähdätään, että mitkä on ne prosessit, mitkä on tapahtunut tämän 4,6 miljardin vuoden aikana.
No, yksi asia, mä jatkaisin vielä tähän, on tietysti selvää, että happea, siis vapaata happea tuottaa biologiset prosessit maassa, mutta ei kai näissä Marsissa ja Venuksessa. Että tässä on valtava ero. Siis muistaakseni maan ilmakehä, niin siitä nyt on jonkin aikaa, kun se suhteellisen nopeasti muuttui hapelliseksi. Ja sen syynä oli biologiset prosessit.
Marsissa se on enemmänkin kemiallinen prosessi sitten se, mikä tuottaa sitä vapaata happea niin sanotusti. Eli hiilidioksidimolekyyli CO2 fotodissosioituu auringon valon vaikutuksesta ja siinä syntyy sitten myös vapaata happea, joka sitten nousee ylös ilmakehään. Ja kyllä ne on erilaisia. Biologia ajaa paljon erilaisia asioita täällä meillä.
Se on hämmästyttävää, että kuitenkin pystyy tuottamaan sitä happea, niin kuin nämä kemialliset prosessit niinkin paljon. Tietysti yhtä hyvin kuin hiilidioksidi katoaa, niin siinä sitä happea menee, kun se on CO2.
Thank you. Perhaps a follow-up question about the methodology, or perhaps I would call it the way we argue for things. So, kind of, it seems like in both cases, in both presentations, we have in one case a planet and in another case a child that are both in some kind of situation, in some kind of circumstances, and you want to make predictions about what's going to happen to a child or to a planet, I suppose we're interested in the Earth. So by looking at other cases like Venus and Mars, and in case of children, other people want to make predictions of what's going to happen, whether there is going to be a mental disorder or atmospheric erosion, right? The question is, how do we make conclusions? Because obviously in both cases, again, there is no direct causal relationship. And in both cases, a planet and a child, there are all kinds of other circumstances that influence the trajectory of development. So how do we separate the different influences? For example, if we take the case of a child, then, for instance, socioeconomic background of the parents, this circumstance comes together with many other factors, like obviously, level of education, ways of bringing up children, like those parental practices. So is it the socioeconomical background that influences whether the child is going to get a mental disorder or not, or is it something else? So, yeah. So how do we argue for things, and how do we make conclusions? And it's about inference, and I suppose, right? I have no idea how you're going to answer this question.
Do you wanna?
Well, one thing that comes to mind, often there's kind of the balance between the approaches you can use in individual studies, and certainly these are important things to consider, that by trying to address, like in our case, as many possible risk factors as possible, at the same time we get a more comprehensive way of looking at the developmental trajectories. On the other hand, the more detailed studies we conduct, the less participants we are likely to get to take part in the studies, because the more intensive the studies, the more likely the participants are bound to quit the studies. This is certainly a difficult question to handle, and I think that on a general level, our study field has been in a state that, for a long time, studies were based on retrospective questionnaires on what happened in your childhood. Now, in last 5 to 10 years, there's been the move to the approach that we show that, yes, these more general factors like parental separation or preterm birth or body size at birth, they still predict these risks of mental disorders, even if we can look at them with a more objective longitudinal design where we have some more reliable measures of these early life adversities. And the current stage that I did not go to in my talk today, what is being done now is to go more like into the specific factors, like what may underlie the associations between, say, poor socioeconomic position or fetal growth with the risk of mental disorders. We are now also trying to address as in more detailed ways as possible the like why are these happening, and other researchers are as well. But I think it's been as is often the case in different fields of research, that you kind of move from one step to another, and I think that step is what is currently only like the studying to be made, go more like why are these associations found, and go more.
Are there any early life adversities that are not associated with mental disorders?
Certainly they are, and going back to this actually this socioeconomic adversity seems to have effects on substance use disorders and more disorders related to antisocial behavior, but not so much on some other like depressive disorders and such. And I think there's often also some factors have more general associations to different types of mental disorders, other affect only others, but not all factors influence everything, certainly not. But I think in a way this research field also there's more and more studies coming up, and I would also be careful in ruling, as careful as I would be in saying that something has a causal association, I would still also be careful in ruling out possible factors in the similar way. So remains to be seen in a way also.
Could you actually say that the ultimate decision for if you got it right is that if you impose some system based on your findings in our society, if that helps with the mental health problems, that would then make your case that you kind of got it right.
Yes.
In the end, I could thought that that's your sort of ultimate goal.
Yeah, that's very much true, and also in those exposures to make things better and not worse. I think in that scenario also identifying these like cellular mechanisms is very important, because through these effects you can like in a more controlled way make these like treatments that, because on these more psychosocial treatments it may be someone may benefit from a treatment related to interpersonal development, even though at that stage there's nothing wrong with the interpersonal development. So in that way, getting to know these also neurobiological mechanisms is a very important approach in this field, but that's certainly a way to go.
From my point, I would say that yes, we cannot do such experiments with planets, unfortunately. So we have to rely on physics and the way we understand the nature works. And the more we understand the details and we can reproduce things in the models which go well with the data, if the data is in situ measured in our solar system, or if it's a remote data which is taken from some other stellar system, if we can reproduce it, then we believe we are on the right track of understanding the physics of happening in the situation and the factors controlling these atmospheric erosion processes.
I have more gentle questions. First one for Riku. You showed the map of, I forgot which experiment it was, but for Mars, where you showed, I think, the oxygen density. First question, was that map statistical, or was it from like for each of these pixels, was it a single point, or was it statistical in the sense that it was like many orbits measurements?
Oh yes, that was a statistical map collected over several orbits around Mars. I think the data may actually even include several years of observations, because we have the spacecraft around planets are usually on a 24-hour orbit, because that makes them easier to operate, because people can follow 24-hour schedule here at Earth when they operate them. So yes, that was collected over a long period of time. And that has, of course, the effect that it will average many things out.
Yeah, well, one thing that seemed that was not averaged out, you seem to have actually an asymmetry, right? There seemed to be more oxygen outflow on the, I think, dusk than dawn, or anyway, on one side more than the other. Is there a physical reason for that?
Oh yes, this goes into the physics of atmospheric erosion a lot, and not all the maps that I showed had a similar projection. So there was, I did not go into details, but there are different types of coordinate systems that we use in our field, and this map was organized according to where the solar wind magnetic field and the electric field are pointing. So when you go into these kind of coordinates, you actually see that the oxygen is escaping on another hemisphere more than the other. So, and that you could see also in one of my modeling figures for Mars, that it prefers the orientation of the electric field in the solar wind. So yeah, and this is a well-known fact.
Okay, so it's just following the convective electric field. Yeah, okay. So when it comes to the Earth, you also mentioned that there's, surprisingly, there is as much oxygen outflow as for a planet like Mars. I could be wrong because that's on my field, but when it comes to the Earth, it has to do with wave-particle interactions, right? So the mechanisms are not really the same, and those wave-particle interactions are due to some electromagnetic turbulence that, though the energy is deposited by the solar wind, is probably particular to the Earth's environment, right? So, like, to which extent could you actually, because to me it seems like completely two different mechanisms. So to which extent can you take what you see at Earth and also transport it perhaps in another environment that is not magnetized?
A great question, and very much into details and the heart of this, what I'm proposing here, that we should study more in the future. Yes, it's a wonder that we get the similar amount of oxygen escaping from these planets, even though the mechanisms are so different. At Earth, yes, as you mentioned, it's the wave-particle interactions, and the whole solar wind interaction with the Earth's environment, it's mediated by the magnetic field. So we don't actually know how much of this oxygen escapes from the Earth's magnetosphere when it flows out from the poles, because it's processed then in the magnetosphere, in the magnetospheric dynamics, which are in part driven by the solar wind, right? So yeah, it's a much more complicated thing that we are used to at Venus and Mars. It's a larger system, it's harder to observe as a total whole system, and I hope we can do that, but you are absolutely right. The ions will be flowing up because of wave-particle interactions. It's called the ion upwelling in technical terms, but at some point the solar wind comes in to the question, of course, because it's driving the whole magnetosphere in many ways. It causes the substorms and the auroral auroral precipitation in the not in the first hand, but by as a geomagnetic process.
And perhaps one question for Marius, because I need to ask both of you. Is there a difference between the risk when it comes to parental separation if the kid is separated from one parent or two parents? Do you get different risk associated with these two different cases?
This is a good question. In our study sample, it was all were exposed to separation from both parents. But yeah, this is also because the circumstances before the separation also play a role. So in like when a child is separated from one parent only, the different reasons vary a lot. It's often, sometimes it's due to the parents' death, divorce by parents, illnesses, other circumstances, and it would seem for mental well-being that also these different reasons for the separation may lead to different outcomes. I think there's not been many studies that would directly compare what happens if you're separated from one or from both parents, but these different types of separations have been compared, and it also would seem that in the long term, looking at adulthood mental health, actually separations due to parental death won't have such strong effects on mental health than separations due to illnesses or being taken to foster care or separations due to parental illnesses. We are still trying to figure out these reasons for this, but I'm sorry, I think there's not yet like direct answer to your question. Perhaps I would tentatively, based on what is known, say that the risks are more evident if you're separated from both parents and you're put to a completely new circumstance, because the child forms these interpersonal relationships and these attachment bonds with his or her parents that help the child in later interpersonal relationships, also in relating to other people. And if all these relationships are stopped at once, then there's no like safe haven or safe basis on what to rely on, and everything is kind of disrupted. But I'm not so sure whether this has been in that direct way examined, but what is known about these other risk factors and how these separations influence those factors, like this. I was talking about this insecure attachment, that is very typical approach to looking at parenting, the effects of child relationships, kind of poor parenting and poor child relationships. These are more common in families with parental separation and also among patients with mental disorders later in life. And through these roots, at least the hypothesis could be made that separation from both parents would have more evident effects.
I have a question for Marius concerning about the international adaptability of the findings of your study. As I noticed that at some point you mentioned the prevalence of mental disorders in Finland in your cohort was something like 1,600 and so on persons, where the percentage of male participants was almost twice as much as females, and then you said that this is expected. Is this expected as a universal result, or is this expected? Is this something peculiar to Finnish study of mental disorders that we have this sort of a 1/3 and 2/3 between the genders?
This is a very good question, and one important point is that depends a bit on the type of mental disorders that are being assessed. Substance use disorders are typically more common among men in all societies, I would say, and all countries, and as these were the most common and typically are the most common mental health outcome across studies, then they, at least when addressing these that lead to hospitalization or contribute to death, then if you look at any mental disorder defined in this way, it's nothing specific to Finnish circumstances that then the mental disorders are more common among men. But on the other hand, mood disorders are, after a certain age, in childhood they are typically equally common among boys and girls, but after something like 8 to 10 years of age and throughout the rest of the life, they're more common among girls than among boys and among women than among men. And I think here the definition of how we define mental disorder, here we define it as the severe mental disorders leading to hospitalization or contributing to death, plays a role in the sex difference, because if we look at some interviews to the whole population and looked at also less severe forms of psychopathology where there's perhaps the affected individual may have the symptoms but doesn't get any treatment for it, or the treatment is in some outpatient care, then mood and anxiety disorders are actually quite close to the prevalence of substance use disorders. And through this route, the sex difference that is in the opposite directions for these diagnostic outcomes kind of may cancel itself out. So I think it has also to do why we find this in with our definition of mental disorders is also that with this definition substance use disorders were more common than the other diagnostic outcomes. Also disorders such as antisocial personality disorder and other disorders that involve aggression towards other people, they are more common typically among men than among women.
About the atmosphere. Of course, it's kind of reasonable finding that we are losing very little oxygen. If you would have found that we are losing huge amounts of oxygen, it would be strange because we still have quite a lot left. So, but about our neighbors, if they are also currently losing very little oxygen, could it just be because they have already lost most of it, so they have little to lose anymore?
Well, absolutely. There are two ways to limit an escape from the atmosphere, and the other one is limited by the energy. So this is a process-related thing, how much energy you have for the escape. And then the other one is the source-limited escape. And it's most likely the planets have moved in this coordinate axis during their lifetime, that at one point it was limited by the energy, there was a lot of source, but then sources maybe get less, and then it started to be source limited, not as much as by the energy limited. So this is definitely something we think about.
I do have a more general question. Are there special papers for the planetary atmosphere studies, now? I mean journals who publish, papers on the subject?
Usually in the geophysical research journals, yes.
But no special journal for planetary atmosphere studies.
But not such major ones that I would know of.
Okay.
So yeah.
So what prefers the traditional ones?
Yes, of course, because the planetary research, it's sort of, it's a whole planet when we study. So it couples from the surface and from the soil to the atmosphere and from the atmosphere to the space. So when you want to understand the development or evolution of a planet, you need to really go through this whole chain. And geophysical research is where you have this whole chain.
I think that there are plenty of journals for mental disorders, available nowadays. There is no lack of them.
Yeah. It's,
okay. Any other questions or remarks? Well, if none, then we can stop here and thank the speakers again, and of course without a good audience there will be no lectures, and so I thank you all. Thank you. We'll meet next time, and it's about a month away. But in the second Monday of November, there will be a conference, which is a meeting which is devoted to all members which have participated in this academic club. So you are all welcome there. It will be in Säätytalo at 17:15. Please come.